So I'm a very slow decision maker. Sandra's a very quick decision maker. I learned in our marriage early on. When she's sure, go with her. Manny, would you just repeat after me? When she's sure, you go with her. No, you got to do the second part too. When she's sure. Oh yeah, that was terrible, wasn't it, women? Hey, I want to start out today by asking everybody a question. And it doesn't matter how old you are, because when this question is going to make you think, oh, that's for younger people. No, it's not. It's for everybody. And here the question says, who do you want to be like? Who do you want to be like? Who do you want to be like when you grow up? Who do you want to be like when you grow up? Does anybody, people come to mind, maybe somebody comes to mind that may be younger than you, but you're like, wow, they're just such a great person. And then if we were having this conversation one-on-one, I would say, why? What about that person makes you think you want to be like them when you grow up, or you just wish you were more like them? What kind of person comes to mind? And then imagine this. Imagine if everybody in the world was more like that person. What a better world it would be, better community it would be, maybe a better family it would be. And for most of us, when we ask that question, once we get, kind of think about it for a minute, we get past all that glitters, we get past all the stuff they have and what they've done and what they've accomplished and what they live in, who they married and what they drive. And eventually you get to the character of the person, because the reason you want to be more like that person is generally because of what kind of person they are. To some extent, if they're the kind of person you want to be, or if somebody came to mind at some level, they're kind of like heroes. Maybe personally because you know them, they've done something for you. Or maybe you just know them from afar, but it's like, wow, in light of what they've done, in light of what they've sacrificed, they're kind of heroes. But they're not heroes because they have superpowers, right? They're simply heroes because of the choices they've made. They chose and they responded their way into our hearts. They chose and they responded their way onto the list of the kinds of people or the person we would like to be. So here's kind of an interesting question. If you get bored with the rest of the message, would you like to be that person that comes to mind when somebody asks someone, hey, would you like to be? I mean, wouldn't it be fun to be at the top of somebody's list, that your name or your face comes to mind when they're asked someday, hey, who do you want to be like, or what kind of person do you like to be? And you could be, but it's what you choose between now and someday that determines whether or not you make someone's list. You have to choose. You'll have to choose ought to, even when it costs you. You'll have to choose ought to, even when it costs you. Today we're in part 4 of our series, Your Integrity, Our World. And we said from the very beginning that in a general sense, integrity is something we're all familiar with. It's kind of the resolve or the courage or the grit or the will to simply do the right, the noble, the honorable thing, just because it's the right, noble, and honorable thing, regardless of the consequence, regardless of the outcome. You just do what you ought to because it's just the thing that you ought to do. So then we took that sort of rambling definition and we shortened it last time and gave you sort of an operating definition that hopefully will hang somewhere in your home, or you'll put it on your desk somewhere, or maybe put it on your kid's mirror, that integrity is simply doing what you ought to, even if it costs you. It's just doing what you ought to, even if it costs you. And as we've said throughout the series, we're often quick to excuse our own personal lack of integrity, but we generally call other people out when they don't do what they ought to. And then there's this side of it we've talked about throughout the series, that our choices regarding our integrity, whether we maintain our integrity or we sacrifice it, our choices may be personal because it's our personal integrity, but we can't kid ourselves. Our choices don't remain private. They are oftentimes people realize or discover or are impacted by our integrity. That's personal, but it isn't private. When the integrity, as we talked about in week 1, when the integrity of a column or the integrity of a beam in a physical structure is compromised, the stress that column or beam or column is supposed to take, that stress is then transferred to the rest of the building. The entire building is stressed. And the same is true for us personally, that when there's a lack of personal integrity on your part, that stress is transferred to the people closest to you. That your lack of integrity, my lack of integrity, always impacts some other persons. That it may be my personal integrity, but it's not private. Ultimately, it impacts some other persons. Or another way of saying that is that our irresponsibility becomes someone else's responsibility. And this may sort of encapsulate your growing up years because you had a very irresponsible younger brother or older sister. And they were so irresponsible that your family was constantly picking up the pieces and spending extra money. In fact, you didn't get the time or attention you deserved growing up because of him, because of her. Or maybe it was your mom, or maybe it was your dad. But the point is this: when somebody is irresponsible, they leave the pieces to be picked up by more responsible people. So again, my integrity is my personal integrity, but it impacts more than just me. It's always going to impact some other persons, the people who are closest to me. But the opposite is true as well, right? Because if you maintain your integrity, if you are a person of integrity, you're just going to do what you ought to do, even if it costs you. You will be a benefit, a blessing, a value add to the people who are closest to you. Now, if you've been following the series, a couple of weeks ago, I gave you sort of our theme verse, and it's from the Old Testament, and I've encouraged all of you to memorize it, so we're not going to say it out loud, unless I think I'm a complete failure as a communicator. I don't have that, much confidence. But I've encouraged you to memorize this verse, and here's what it says. Proverbs 11:3 says this. The integrity of the upright will guide them. There's our word. The integrity of the upright will guide them. People with integrity are guided by their integrity. That's how they make decisions. That's their decision-making filter. I'm just going to do what I ought to do, even if it costs me, because I'm a person of integrity. But the flip side, but the crookedness or the bentness or the focus right in front of them person, but the crookedness of the treacherous will ultimately destroy them. Then last time we were together, we talked about a fascinating story from the Old Testament. It was a story involving food. It was, and the primary character, the main character in the story, if you were here, made a really bad integrity decision. I'll see if you can fill in this blank. He traded his future for a bowl of, anyone? Stew, thank you. Yeah, he traded his whole future for a bowl of stew. And as I was telling the story, even if you've never heard the story before, that we were just sort of struck by how ridiculous that would be, that somebody would trade their entire future for a bowl of stew. So we talked through that today. Another Old Testament story, and interestingly enough, it also has to do with food. But the main character in this story actually models the way forward by doing what he ought to do, even when it would in fact, or could in fact, cost him. This is the setup for one of the most famous stories in the Bible that we're going to talk about next time. So this is the backstory to the famous story, okay? Around 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, defeated the Egyptian and the Assyrian army in a very famous ancient battle called the Battle of Carchemish. And the Battle of Carchemish, it was a famous battle because he was supposed to lose, but he won. He defeated the Egyptian army, what was left of the Assyrian Empire. That was the end of the Assyrian Empire. And he was so happy that on his way back to Babylon, he decided he would just defeat everybody else between Egypt and Babylon. So he makes his way through what we would call Israel. He goes to Judah, which is sort of southern Israel, and he defeats the armies. There wasn't much of an army. He goes into the city of Jerusalem. He takes the king out, puts in a new king, and then declares that Judah, the southern part of Israel, the southern kingdom, would become a vassal state to Babylon, and they would pay him tribute for the rest of his life and forever and ever and ever. And he's so thrilled about this. And he took the king and he sent him on to Babylon because he had a king collection that we'll talk about some other time. We've talked about that before. But he also took some other souvenirs from the city of Jerusalem. And that's where we're going to jump into the story. Here's what happened. Nebuchadnezzar, king of, or emperor, or they didn't have empires back then, but basically the king of Babylon, ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his royal court, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from Jerusalem specifically, from the royal family and the nobility. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a really smart guy. Here's what he would do. Anytime he would conquer a city or conquer a nation or conquer specifically a capital city, again, they didn't have that terminology, instead of just destroying everybody, he would take the brain trust, the best and the brightest, with him back to Babylon. And then he would give them positions of power and influence so that he had this very cosmopolitan city in Babylon. It was very international. And it was his way of saying to the world, I have conquered the world. Because come to the great city of Babylon, you will see people here from all over the world, all the nations that I have conquered. So that was kind of his MO. That's how he operated. Pretty smart. Young men, the text continues, young men without any physical defect he brought from Jerusalem, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Got to pause the story one more time. Now, if you are a young man, these are teenagers, 13 through maybe 16, 17, maybe even younger. If you're a young man and you're in the defeated, conquered city of Jerusalem, and you get chosen by Ashpenaz to be taken to Babylon to serve in the palace of the most powerful and wealthy person on planet Earth, okay? You have pretty much won the lottery. Now, if you're gonna be kidnapped anyway, this is the best way to be kidnapped, okay? You're not gonna work in the salt mines. You're not gonna be put on the front lines for battle fodder. You're not gonna be put on a construction site that's dangerous, and if you're injured, they just leave you to die. You get to live in, work in the palace. So right before you are carried off to Babylon, this is when your father gets on his knees and looks you in the eye and says, son, don't mess this up. Okay, this is about as good. We're gonna starve to death back here in Jerusalem. Don't mess this up because, son, there are plenty more where you came from. The king, but it gets better. The king assigned them, these young men, a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. There is a meal plan built into this kidnapping. I mean, this is amazing. Now, my mentor, Charlie Renfro, that I quote him all the time. Sometimes I change his name so he just doesn't get all the credit for all the things I've learned in my life. But he said this early on when we were sitting down together, business guy. He said, Andy, there's rule number one and number two. Rule number one and number two in life. You got to eat and live indoors. That's rule number one and number two. Everybody's got to eat and live indoors, okay? So these guys have been guaranteed they're not only going to live indoors in the palace or around the palace, they're going to eat, and it's not just any meal plan. Now, again, to put this in context, in ancient times, people were always hungry or on the verge of starvation. That food insecurity was just a way of life because there were really only two things. There were really only two things that maintained their value, and nutrition over time: grain and wine. That's it. Grain and wine. You could salt meat, but eventually even salted meat would spoil. Vegetables would spoil. The only thing that was really transferable was grain and wine. So if there was a famine, if there was a hiccup, if raiders, came in at harvest time and stole your harvest, I mean, people just lived with food insecurity all the time. So to be guaranteed food, and not just any food from the king's palace, this was a really, really, really big deal. These boys would never go hungry. And then it goes on, they were to be trained for 3 years around the palace, and after that, if they made the cut, they would enter the king's service. I mean, this is like, how do you like me now? Dear mom and dad, tell my friends, you're not going to believe this, okay? This is amazing. And of course, of these boys kidnapped or taken from Jerusalem, there were the Fab Four: Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We've heard those names before. Those are famous Old Testament characters. Now, when they get to Babylon, they're given different names. This is an important part of the story. If you rename something, what does that indicate? It indicates that whatever you rename belongs to you. If you name something, it indicates that that thing belongs to you. You named your children, right? You renamed a pet. I I adopted this pet and I don't like that, and I'm going to change the name. Well, that's my pet. I can do whatever I want to. So when Nebuchadnezzar changes the names of these boys and gives them Babylonian names, all of which connect somehow to the Babylonian gods, it's his way of saying, okay, you belong to me. You don't just serve me. You don't just work for me. You belong to me. You are a possession. And I am your final authority. Because I'm not asking, I'm telling. And this is where the story takes an interesting twist and a famous twist if you grew up in church. But Daniel did not take his father's advice. But Daniel resolved. Two Hebrew words here. Two Hebrew words that literally say he set his heart. He set his heart. He made up his mind. But Daniel resolved, made up his mind not to defile himself. Again, little Hebrew word. Literally means to pollute or to stain, to permanently stain or pollute. No way to get this out. To pollute or stain. Figuratively, it means he decided not to desecrate himself or lower himself or undignify himself or reject what he knew was true of himself with the royal food and wine. To which, based on everything I've said so far, if you read the story for yourself, it's like, okay, why? I mean, come on, Daniel, before you tell anybody, come here. Look, you're far away from home. And I know there's probably some religious thing going on, but you realize your God just got beat, I'll be polite, beat bad by Marduk. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar went into your temple and raided your temple and kidnapped you. So I know you got religious convictions, and I know, whatever, you grew up as a good Hebrew boy, but come on. This is your break. This is your lucky day. This is your future. What do you mean you're gonna reject the meal plan? You reject the meal plan, okay, they're just gonna replace you. And you're not going back home. You're just gone. Now, why in the world was the food such a big deal? And here's why. And I try to figure out a simple way for us to understand, because it's such a cultural thing in ancient times. You don't need to raise your hand, it's a rhetorical question, but have you ever heard anyone pray? In fact, maybe this is part of your mealtime prayer. Most of us have heard this. It goes like this: bless his food to nourish and strengthen our bodies. This is a common mealtime prayer. In fact, if you've prayed this, you probably don't even know exactly where it came from or the implications of what it means, but it's kind of a habit. Please bless this food to nourish and strengthen our bodies. Now, this little English, American-ish prayer points to a chain of events that ancient people took very literally. And perhaps we should take it more literally as well. And here's the chain of events this little prayer relates to. It goes like this: that God provides the food because he makes the rain fall and the crops to grow. God provides food that goes into the body that brings health, that ultimately brings prosperity. You can't have prosperity without health, the body, food, and thus God. So God provides the food, sends the rain, keeps the locusts away, goes into the body, brings health and prosperity. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's food, his choice wine and his choice food, was blessed by and provided by Marduk, the Babylonian god. So Marduk was going to get credit for Daniel's health and his prosperity and his intelligence and the way he was eventually perhaps going to succeed within the context of the Babylonian palace. This would be an admission that Marduk was more powerful than Yahweh. And they were already questioning how powerful Yahweh was, because Yahweh's city just got invaded, right? So Daniel decides as a teenager, he put all this together from the outset: I am not going to play that game. Daniel made up his mind. I'm not playing that game. Basically, he decided, or he refused, he decided that I'm not going to be used as evidence that Marduk is anything but a figment of the Babylonian imagination. I'm not going to do anything to somehow underscore or bring attention to the fact that Marduk is even real. And so he went to this length to stay out of that assumption, to stay away from that assumption. Just not going to play that game from the very beginning. And here's the point. And this is why we dare not rush by this little piece of narrative in the Old Testament. Daniel made up his mind, but here's the kicker. Here's the catch. Here's the point. Honestly, here's the challenge. Daniel made up his mind ahead of time, before he knew how his story would end. In fact, this is so important for some of us today. The only reason we know his story is because he made up his mind. The only reason we know this story, and the only reason we're telling the story, the thing that makes this a story worth telling and a story worth writing and a story worth remembering, is not that Daniel was kidnapped with a bunch of people who had names that we don't even know other than his three friends. The thing that makes this a story worth remembering, the reason it's inspirational, the reason it made it into the Hebrew scripture, is because he made up his mind ahead of time. And there is direct application for all of us, because the same may be true of your story and mine. When there's an ought to that could cost you, when there's an ought to that could cost you, I'm not sure I'll get the job. I'm not sure she'll call me back. I'm not sure she's ever going to, I think the relationship's over if I do that or if I don't do that. I don't know how they're going to respond. I won't have any friends. I don't even know if I can show up at school the next day. when there is an ought to that potentially costs you, you are on the verge of a story that perhaps you will tell for the rest of your life and might make your story worth telling. And this is why we're going to talk about this in just a minute. Come back to it. I said this last time, we don't know what hangs in the balance of ought to, even when we're convinced it will cost us. But Daniel made up his mind ahead of time. And the reason he did is because Daniel remembered what we easily forget, and then we remember it when it's too late. He remembered something that we easily forget, and then we remember it when it's too late. And it's basically this, that one breach of integrity leads to another, right? Because the first breach, you know this, makes the second breach easier. Well, I already crossed that line. Well, I already did that once. Yeah, well, my last job, yeah, that was just sort of what we did, so, whatever. Yeah, I always told myself I would never do that. I would never go there. I would never be a part of that. I would never participate in that. I always told myself, but there was that one weekend, that one thing, that one week, that job, and I did it. Now here it is, another opportunity to do the same thing. And I've already done it once. I've already been there once. I've already crossed that line once. And then the second breach creates a pattern, a direction. And as we say all the time around here, direction, not intention. Direction, not our goals. Direction, not our dreams for the future. Direction, not intention, determines our ultimate destination in this life. That direction determines our legacy. Direction determines our story. Direction determines whether or not our story is even worth telling. So the amazing thing about this little incident in the life of Daniel is that it's not just that he made up his mind, he made up his mind ahead of time, knowing that it literally might limit his time. But the story goes on, if you're familiar with it, and it takes another interesting twist, because Daniel decides not to keep this decision to himself or keep it a secret, just the opposite. The text says this, that Daniel asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. He went to the person who's handing out the food and, rolling out the meal plan. He says, look, I would like not to partake of the king's meal, the king's wine, the king's meat, this rich food. And the interesting thing is, he didn't pretend or mislead, because that would have been a lack of integrity. To pretend he's eating it when he's not, to say, see, God, I'm not really eating this, I'm feeding this to the dog, and you see how God, me and you were fine. Daniel knows that's not integrity. Integrity isn't pretending. Integrity is, I'm gonna be upfront about this, realizing this may be the end for me, but I'm just not gonna violate my conscience. I'm gonna do what I ought to do. So he goes to the person whose job, and as we'll see in a minute, his life is on the line as to how these boys turn out, and says, hey, I would like a pass on this. And now the stage is set. I don't want you to miss this. I know we talk about this sometimes, but I just don't want you to miss this. The stage is set. Daniel this is amazing, has placed himself. He had a choice. You have a choice. Daniel has placed himself at the mercy of God. Daniel has stepped out to do what he ought to do, and it's a free fall, and he has no control over the consequence. But he's doing what his heart tells him to do and what he knows God wants him to do. So he's placed himself at the mercy of God, and mercy is not in the Babylonian vocabulary, and mercy definitely isn't in Nebuchadnezzar's vocabulary, as we're going to discover. Daniel's only hope was that God would intervene. And God had not promised to intervene. Here's the reason this is important for us. When we sacrifice our integrity, to get ahead, or to protect ourselves from what we assume will be a harmful outcome financially, relationally, professionally, when we sacrifice our integrity to get ahead, we close the door on the opportunity for God to do something unique in our story. We remove that opportunity. We remove that potential because we've taken things into our own hands. And again, you'll never know what God might have done if you had placed yourself on his mercy and simply done what you knew you ought to do. Please, 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 please. never close the door. Never close the door on a now God potential moment. That's the next two words in the text. Now God. Now God. Now, this would be so much easier if God had appeared to Daniel in a dream and said, hey, don't eat the food, it's all going to work out. That'd be a lot easier for you too, right? Don't call her back because somebody else better is coming along. All right, it's easy, you know? Don't worry, they're not going to hire you, but 2 weeks from now, you're going to look back and be so glad they didn't hire you because you're not going to believe what's coming down the road for you financially, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, what kind of faith does that take? That's not faith, that's just common sense, right? But that's never how it works out. That's not how it worked out for Daniel. That's why this is such an important story. He made up his mind ahead of time before he knew how his own story would go, but it's because he made up his mind that we're telling his story. He was just doing what he ought to do. Now, God had caused the official, God's working in the background, but Daniel doesn't know that. You don't know that. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, okay, I get that, and you guys seem like you're really great kids, and I'm so glad you're part of this thing, but I am afraid, okay? I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why? Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? I mean, every once in a while he walks through here and looks around to see who's coming up through the ranks, coming up to the point of serving him in the future and his family. I mean, why should he see you looking worse than the other men your age? The king would then have my head. See, we talk about, they're going to have my head. This was not a figure of speech. In fact, you want to know where that figure of speech came from? It came from right here. This wasn't like, he'll have my head. No, literally. Like, he will have my head. It will be in a basket, and my body will be buried somewhere. Not even buried, left for the birds. And my head will be put on a wall somewhere as a reminder, don't mess with the king. So this isn't a casual endeavor. This is not a casual decision. My life is at risk if this does not work out. So Daniel's like, hey, I get that. So, tell you what, let's do a 10-day test. This is so powerful. He says, for the next 10 days, just 10 days, you let us eat vegetables and just drink water. You feed the rest of the guys the rich meat and the royal wine. And then, hey, we'll come back and you compare. And then, at the end of 10 days, this is so powerful, then you treat your servants in accordance with what you see. Okay? In other words, you come back and you deal with us accordingly. Just turn us in for refusing to participate. And we will take responsibility for our decision. So, he agreed. He agreed to test and tested them for 10 days. And then, of course, if you know the story, at the end of 10 days, because you can imagine what the wine was like and what the rich meat was like, at the end of 10 days, I mean, basically they were doing what some of you do all the time. You just eat healthy and eat clean and drink water. Water is a little bit dangerous, but somehow they took a risk and drank the water instead of the wine. And at the end of the day, 10 days, they are better nourished and they look better than the boys who ate the royal food. And then they do this for 3 years, and 3 years later, they're interviewed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And lo and behold, the king found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah. These are their Babylonian names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. Now, this next line, okay, this next line is so amazing. If you're just reading the Bible by yourself, you know, you kind of go through this stuff like, yeah, whatever, what time is it? Okay, have I read long enough, God? Are we good? Okay, you got, okay, I'm sure you don't do that. So this next line is so powerful. This next line is the providence of God setting up events that just go for decades and decades and decades. And Daniel remained there in the king's palace, working for the king. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Any guess as to how many years that is? I'll tell you, 70. Wow is exactly right. That's the proper response. 70. For 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar dies. Daniel's still there. Darius the Great, the King of Kings, we'll talk about in a minute. He comes along. Daniel's still there. Darius is gone. Cyrus is on the scene. Daniel, he's like 85 years old. He's probably the oldest person in the whole empire at this point. He's still there. And where did it begin? It began with this first decision that set him up for all the ones that would follow. He was strategically positioned to script and to observe and to record God's activity on behalf of his people for 70 years. And of course, through the time, his faith and his integrity was tested over and over and over. In fact, his most famous test would happen 55 years after this event. Because by that time, the Persian Empire was the empire. The Babylonians had gone the way of all ancient empires. And Darius, the king of kings, the famous Darius, king of kings, was the emperor. And Darius, now all these years later, Daniel's 70 years old, so we're skipping like way ahead, right? He's 70 years old. So Darius decides he's going to reorganize the empire. And again, it was so difficult to run an empire in those days because everything was so slow in communication. By the time he found out something had happened, something else had happened. So he reorgs the entire empire, and he decides he's going to appoint 120 governors for the whole empire. And then he's going to appoint 3 administrators to administrate the 120 governors. And he chose Daniel as one of the 3 administrators to oversee the 120 governors that are going to oversee the entire empire. Jumping into that part of the story. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators. There's just 3. So he's got 3 administrators, and Daniel's clearly the oldest. But he so distinguished himself among the administrators, he's not even from there. He's a Hebrew. And the governors, by his exceptional qualities, that the king planned to set Daniel over the whole empire. Yeah, I'm busy, you handle it. Just, if it's really, really important, you bring it to me. But Daniel, you run this thing. At this, as you might imagine, the administrators and the governors tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. This is so amazing, and oh my goodness, is this relevant? Now, here's the picture. Daniel has been in government for 55 years. Surely there's some dirt, right? Surely there's some skeletons in the closet. By the way, skeletons in the closet, that was a literal thing too. Okay, that's figurative for us. This is all literal. This is where all this stuff came from. There are skeletons in the closet. We put name tags on them. If you want to know how powerful I am, let me show you some skeletons. Remember this guy? Remember this? Or, okay, anyway. So he's been in government for 55 years. I mean, surely there's some dirt on this guy. And now you have folks at the highest level of government looking for stuff they can pin on Daniel. But they were unable to do so. This is amazing. This is something to aspire to. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. When people came looking, they found nothing. That's who you want at the highest level of government. That's who you want at the highest level in community. That's who you want at the highest level of family, right? And Daniel, this is the point of today's message. Daniel was that person at 70 because he made up his mind at 17. I'm just not going to play that game. I'm not going to be used. I'm going to place myself at the mercy of God, not at the mercy of a king who's here today and gone tomorrow, and then the next one was here today and gone tomorrow. Hey guys, I'm on king number 3, okay? This isn't my first rodeo. I've been through 3 kings. I serve a king that's always the king. These other kings, they come and they go. And why would I sacrifice my integrity for mortal kings who are here today and gone tomorrow? And as Jesus would say, and can't touch your soul. And all along the way, as you discover in this story, Daniel's integrity is not tied to, hey, here's what I think is the right thing to do. It's tied to his faith. All along the way, his integrity was anchored to who he trusted in and the God that he worshiped. His enemies knew that. They were jealous of that. Here's their conclusion. We'll wrap this up. This is so powerful. Finally, these men, these guys have access to everything. If there's dirt, they're going to find the dirt. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Daniel was guided by his integrity. The integrity of the upright guide them. And his integrity guided him because his integrity was anchored, not just to an ought to, but to the divine lawgiver who put ought to in the hearts of every single man, woman, and child. And that's why he had the courage to make up his mind ahead of time. Now, we're going to pick up the story of Daniel next time, and it is the most famous Daniel story there is, so you're not going to want to miss next time. But real quick, what about us? What about us? What about you? Have you made up your mind? Have you made up your mind? Most folks haven't. And here's why most folks haven't. Here's perhaps why you haven't made up your mind ahead of time that you're just going to do the right thing no matter what it costs you. And I understand this, right? For most people, it's one day at a time. Well, we'll just have to see. I mean, I don't plan to ever do that, but if it was him or if it was her or if it was that or if it was it, I don't know what I would do if it was, that. I mean, right? So we just make up our mind a day at a time, an opportunity at a time, a deal at a time, a relationship at a time. No pre-deciding, because here's the problem with pre-deciding. Here's the problem with making up your mind ahead of time. It will limit your options. It will limit you. It is too limiting. And if there is no God, if there is no divine ought to, if we're just making this up, then yeah, don't make up your mind ahead of time. You'll miss out on some things that perhaps you don't want to miss out on, shouldn't miss out on. But if you don't make up your mind ahead of time, integrity won't guide you. Do you know what's going to guide you? Fear will guide you. Specifically, FOMO will guide you. Because the fear of missing out is what sets us up to sacrifice our integrity. Do you know how much this is worth, honey? No, have you seen her? Have you seen him? Have you seen what he drives? Have you seen where they live? Have I shown you the offer? I mean, look, if I do this, I get invited back. I mean, it's the fear of missing out, right? Does the world need more people who decide a day at a time, an hour at a time, an opportunity at a time simply because they're afraid of missing out? I don't think so. Do you want to be that kind of person? Do you want to be known as that kind of person? Don't you find, I do, don't you find this extraordinarily inspiring? Don't you find this this is somebody worth hiring? They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. I mean, is there something in you that's like, I want to be that person? Yeah, and here's why. Because we know. We know. In fact, you were reminded of this, even though you didn't have the words at the beginning of the message when I said, who do you want to be like? And who you want to be like when you grow up, or who you wish you were more like now. They're like Daniel. That question causes us to sit up straight and to quit looking down and to look out. So if you haven't already made up your mind, would you just go ahead and make up your mind ahead of time to be the person you want to be, that you ought to be? Decide, you know what, I'm going to be a Daniel, or I'm going to be a Danielle. Either one's great, right? Would you make up your mind to do what you ought to do, even if it costs you? This is important. And when you realize that it might cost you, instead of losing your mind and losing your cool and freaking out and staying up all night trying to figure out how you can have your cake and eat it, when you realize, if I do this, if I say this, if I say no to this, if I say yes to this, if I go there, if I choose not to go there, if I decide not to participate, when you realize it might cost you, you just hang on. You are at the precipice of a potential now God moment. You have just done what Daniel did. You have just placed your future, your career, your friends, your future in high school, where you go to school, who you meet, who you marry. You've just placed all of that in the hands of your merciful God. You've just created space for potential now God moment. And there's no guarantee. There is no guarantee. But it's worth it. Those are defining moments. Those are defining moments for you, and those are defining moments potentially for the people closest to you. Those are the moments you may talk about the rest of your life. And as I'm going to tell you next week, I'm going to tell you a story about my dad next week that happened when I was in the 8th grade. His decision when I was in the 8th grade was a defining moment for me. And that's your opportunity. Every time you choose, I'm going to do what I ought to do, knowing this may cost me. Because while it's your integrity impacts your world. It's your integrity for sure, but it's our world. Don't miss next time. Now, before you go, 3 quick questions to talk about over lunch or with your small group during the week. Question number 1 is this. Goes back to the very beginning. Who do you want to be like? And is your answer based on what they've accomplished, who they are, maybe a combination of both? Number 2, one breach of integrity often leads to another, makes the second one easier. Where have you seen this played out? Personally, if you want to share that with some folks, or maybe you've seen it play out in somebody else's life, or maybe organizationally, maybe nationally. And number 3, and this is kind of setting us up for some later conversation. Have you ever attempted to rebuild trust with someone after a breach of integrity? What was your approach? Did it work? Did they give you a second chance? If not, why not? Integrity. Doing what we ought to do. Doing what you ought to do, even if it costs you. We celebrate it when we see it. People celebrate it in us when they see it. So I want to challenge you. Make up your mind ahead of time and place your future in the hands of your merciful God. Heavenly Father, easy to stand up here and talk about. Difficult to walk out the door or turn off the television or go out into the real world, go to work, to school, and do. But Father, would you raise up, if you would raise up the generation of men and women who've just made up their mind ahead of time, don't care, gonna do the right thing, gonna treat people the way they need to be treated, gonna tell the truth, gonna show up because I said I would show up. Father, raise up a generation of leaders like that in our nation and in our world. And I pray that we would be among them and our children and our grandchildren would be because they heard our stories. In Jesus' name, amen.